This episode contains descriptions of violence and sexual assault that may be triggering or difficult for some listeners. As always, we'll try to cover it in a way that's honest but not gratuitous. However, if you want to avoid this kind of content, consider sitting this one out. Welcome to Crime and Sacrifice. I'm your host, Brianna, and this is episode 6, Shawcross, Part 2. Police in Rochester had finally narrowed in on a suspect in a string of murders that had been haunting the city for months. Who was Arthur Shawcross? Was his life destined to play out the way that it did? Could he have grown into a different man? I think it's worth asking the questions. Arthur Shawcross was born in Kittery, Maine on June 6, 1945, to Arthur Roy and Bessie Shawcross. It was just a few months before the end of World War II, and they named their firstborn after his father. They would go on to have 3 more kids, and settled eventually in the Watertown area of New York State, a blue-collar community located on the eastern shores of Lake Ontario. Like many older U.S. towns, it's a place that seems stuck in time, with big old houses, huge trees lining the main street, where the locals seem to know everybody else. The kind of place that lulls you into a sense of security, valid or not. For the Shawcross family, Watertown became home. Actually, several Shawcross families settled on the same big farmstead in what came to be known locally as Shawcross Corners, with multiple generations of Shawcross relatives living there together. Arthur Jr. was a pretty baby that grew up into a cute boy, spent his childhood in Watertown, and at Shawcross Corners surrounded by extended family. At first, nobody noticed anything remarkable about him, maybe a quietness or a blankness at times, but nothing that raised any real concern. And when he received all A's and B's in first grade, his parents were happy, figured they were raising a normal, well-adjusted boy. And yet, somewhere around this time, Art started developing some concerning behaviors that caused alarm for some members of his family. For one thing, he just started to withdraw socially from the other kids at school, and from his cousins, even his siblings, preferring to go off by himself to play, often in the woods, and developing several imaginary friends to keep him company. But when Arthur was in social settings, he would often adopt this very strange, juvenile manner and voice, a way of speaking that seemed younger than his years, and it suggested that maybe he wanted people to baby him. He seemed to always be craving attention from his parents and other authority figures. He even staged several runaway attempts as a kid, where he seemed to relish the fact that the entire family was out looking for him. He would also have frequent nightmares and would wet the bed. As he grew older, these behaviors only led to more isolation, especially among his peers. In fact, he would even speak to his imaginary friends at school, would also have these weird or spastic movements in class that earned him the nickname of Oddie and led to some bullying by the other kids. His parents began to wonder if maybe he was slow, so Arthur was given several IQ tests as a kid. He usually scored around 100, which is just a perfectly average IQ. Sometimes several points lower, but really nothing that would cause great concern. But all of this negative attention seems to have encouraged Art to act out even more. He quickly learned how to be a bully himself, saying cruel or crude things to other kids, starting these fights where he would have to be physically dragged off of the other kids, and often targeting kids that were younger than he was, more vulnerable. He seemed to go out of his way to tease them, and liked making younger kids cry. When it came to his parents, maybe the most important authority figures for you when you're a kid, Art still craved their attention and wanted them to be proud of him, despite the fact that he was acting out. Arthur would say later that he always felt like he wasn't good enough for his mom and dad, like they preferred their other kids. In order to try to capture more of their attention, Arthur would often feign illness and injury just to get their sympathy and the attention specifically of his mom. As he grew out of the youngest years of childhood, Art still seemed to prefer wandering out in the woods on his own, rather than connecting with family or friends, exchanging the imaginary friends of his youth with a love for hunting and fishing that would continue for the rest of his life. Except again, Arthur developed a cruel streak here. Rather than hunting with a respect for wildlife and the lives that he took, family would later report that Art seemed to enjoy toying with animals, like he enjoyed watching them suffer. And a warning for sensitive listeners, I'm going to describe some of his mistreatment of animals. Feel free to skip ahead. Arthur would skin fish alive to see how long it took for them to die. He tied cats together, shot darts at frogs nailed to wooden boards, tossed kittens in bags into water. Some pretty horrific torture that most normal and normally developing people would not be able to stomach. But Art could engage in such cruelty without any remorse, which is perhaps foreshadowing the violence he inflicted later in life. And for those of you that know anything about the McDonald triad, torturing animals is strike 2. Basically, it's 3 risk factors or warning signs to look out for that have been present in the development of a lot of serial killers. So it includes bedwetting, which Arthur did, torturing animals, which he did, and the third and last one is arson. So it may not be a big surprise to learn that Arthur also developed a fascination with fire as he entered adolescence. And he began starting fires recklessly. Strike 3. But Art's family did love him, and they were normal, well-adjusted people themselves that couldn't see the storm brewing in their son. We have the benefit of a lot of research and insight into cases like this, the clarity of hindsight into what Arthur ultimately became. But at the time, and maybe to some extent still today, it's typical for families to chalk this kind of behavior up to just growing pains, to ignore it or label it as a type of typical adolescent rebellion. It's hard to pinpoint where this cruelty started, where it came from, if not simply in his own mind and the choices he continued to make. Yes, there was his difficulty with other people, which might have stemmed from a lack of empathy or some inability to connect. But there are plenty of people that this applies to who aren't ever intentionally cruel. Arthur would claim later that he was sexually abused as a child, which, yeah, I could see that causing trauma and causing him to be further isolated and withdrawn. Maybe could cause him to want to inflict cruelty on others because of pain he suffered himself. He claims that some very important women in his life abused him. It's hard to know. I mean, so many years have passed, and it's not like somebody would readily admit this if it happened. But I've done a fair amount of digging on this. He had a younger brother, many male cousins who had access to these same women, and every single other family member denies that there was any abuse going on. And yeah, sexual abuse is unfortunately quite common in our world. But the vast majority of people who suffer this abuse grow up to be good people. When Arthur finally entered high school, he had cemented himself as an oddball and bully, not somebody to be messed with. He didn't have friends really, but he also didn't seem scared or apprehensive around the other kids anymore. He would always crack jokes or have loud outbursts in class, testing how much he could get away with. He would walk around the halls snapping at girls' bras and was prone to pick fights with other boys. And outside of school, Arthur's crimes continued and escalated in some ways. He was suspected of starting several serious fires and burglarizing homes in the neighborhood while he was still in school, though he wasn't caught or convicted at the time. When he failed the 9th grade, Arthur simply stopped going as his life unraveled further. He continued committing crimes and starting fires, and was eventually caught for several of these, mainly petty ones like theft and vandalism, and he was arrested and given several short jail sentences. But as he grew through his teenage years, and to the relief of his family, it seemed like Art might finally be growing out of this phase of his life, like he might turn things around. In his late teens, Arthur met another Watertown local named Sarah Louise Chattertoe, and the two began dating. For maybe the first time in his life, Art seemed motivated for the future, enough so that he stopped acting out, stopped engaging in crime. It was only several months later, in 1964, that Sarah and Art got married, when he was just 19 years old. 1 year later, the couple had a son. But despite appearances and the hopes of his parents, their marriage was not a happy one. Arthur struggled to hold down regular employment, hobbling together a string of odd jobs and spending much of his free time alone. It didn't take long before whatever motivation he had grown crumbled, and Art returned to committing petty yet distressing crimes like arson and trespassing. The latter earned him a probation sentence that same year that his son was born. Soon afterward, Sarah left him and asked the courts for a divorce, claiming that he was abusive without going into details. Arthur seemed upset about it, but he agreed to the divorce and to give up custody of his son. It would be the last time that he would ever see the boy. And despite his strange behavior and the hurt he inevitably seemed to cause to those closest to him, Art had actually grown into a young man that seemed pretty normal, well adjusted to those who first met him, though he did still have a difficulty in forming deep connections with most people. It also seems clear that Art did feel some things deeply, that he actually did fall in love after his divorce with another woman in town named Linda McNeary, and his life seemed again as though it might turn around. She was intelligent and loved animals, especially horses. She had actually almost married another man right out of high school, but this man realized he was gay and he didn't want to put her through that. She had carefully put this plan together for her future, and now it was gone, and she felt no longer sure of anything. She was working at a bar when she met Art, and she was attracted to him right away, noticed how impeccably he was dressed. It was awkward that first night as Linda and Art chatted, but he invited her to dance. As they talked, both kind of loosened up a little bit, and Arthur was very candid about his wife leaving him, the loss of his son. Something about it resonated with her own feelings of loss. It wasn't long before they were dating and found relative happiness together, despite Art's job as a packer at a local cheese factory, which didn't really impress Linda, and some quirks that she noted in his personality. Arthur proved to be a quiet and tidy man, reserved and yet sometimes very juvenile, bursting into fits of tears when his feelings were hurt, and insisting that she call him Art or Artie. He refused to drive a car, preferring instead to take his bicycle around to get to work. But when she pressed him for a reason, he was evasive, alluded to some kind of phobia of driving. Linda also found that he was completely averse to any kind of spontaneity. If they made plans, they would have to stick to them at all costs, since he had this militant way of staying on schedule, and would grow visibly angry if she was late or tried to do something unexpected. Soon she was meeting his family at Shawcross Corners, and she got along with them, his mom and dad, and thought they seemed nice, if a bit distant. Arthur would actually talk about his mom a lot, would claim that he loved her unconditionally, and yet he never felt like the love was returned, that in some way she disapproved of him, though Linda herself could never see it. As months passed and Arthur's divorce from Sarah was finalized, Arthur was drafted into military service for Vietnam. It was April of 1967, and Art and Linda decided soon afterward that they should marry. He went off to basic training, but on his furlough, the two of them eloped. She was 20 years old, and he was 22 at the time. And at first, Arthur seemed elated, genuinely, so happy to be married again. And Linda was swept up in it, looking forward to their first day and night together as a married couple. And yet, it definitely wasn't the romantic situation she imagined. Arthur insisted that they go fishing that day, which was still one of his favorite activities. Linda sat nearby, frustrated and worried, wondering what kind of marriage she had gotten herself into. They still weren't intimate that first night, and the next day, Arthur was gone, on his way to war. The months they had known each other seemed like a blur, and Linda had to admit that she still didn't know Arthur as well as she would like. But she still felt happy at the thought of their future. When Arthur's ex-wife Sarah contacted Linda to warn her, telling her that there was some kind of violence in him, Linda couldn't believe it. Yeah, he may have been odd with some things, may have had occasional bouts of anger, but Arthur had never been abusive, had always been gentle and kind. Linda chalked Sarah's claims of abuse to some kind of jealous attempt to split them up, and she ignored the warning entirely. A year passed with Arthur overseas. Linda bided her time and continued working, and she looked forward to the letters that Arthur would send, was somewhat alarmed when the first batch alluded to how difficult it was to be surrounded by so much suffering, how much it bothered him. But soon, his letters didn't mention the war at all, and were usually just sweet love letters. A few months into his service, Arthur was given leave, and Linda flew out to Hawaii to meet him. She was relieved when they were finally intimate, and found him to be more or less the man that she remembered, gentle and kind. He did seem a bit moody, but she figured it must be due to the pressures he was under in war. She didn't ask about it. When Linda got back to Watertown from her trip, she thought that she should make an effort to get closer to Arthur's parents. She started going over there often and found that they too were sweet once you got to know them. She noticed they had a hard time expressing their affection, but that was common and is common in a lot of families. Arthur's mom, Betty, eventually opened up to Linda about her doubts when Arthur was growing up, alluding to all of the trouble he got into and how difficult it was for her as his mother. She talks about an incident where he had been hit on the head and fell unconscious as a boy, how his attitude seemed to shift afterward. This is probably ringing alarm bells for those that are familiar with other warning signs that might cause somebody to become a serial killer. Finally, after a year of active duty, Arthur was removed from service overseas and stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. He was given several weeks of leave before they had to move, and Linda was happy for the time with him. They ended up staying at a cottage behind his parents' house at Shawcross Corners, and things seemed good, like they could finally get their lives started. However, despite how smoothly things seemed to be going, there was one incident at the time that planted a seed of real doubt in Linda about Art. One night, Linda startled Art while he was asleep. Just as he was startled awake, he punched her in the face with such force that it nearly broke her jaw. Linda was completely shocked, but he genuinely had seemed startled awake, crying about it and apologizing. She figured it was just jumpiness or trauma caused by the war, and she tried to forget it, found herself working to comfort him right afterward as he cried. But she couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside his mind. If it was something that had happened during the war, or if it was something that she just hadn't seen before. But pretty soon they were busy trying to prepare for their move to Oklahoma, and these concerns were kind of pushed aside. They packed up all of their belongings along with a cat they'd gotten named Smokey and made the drive across the country. Linda was still looking forward to spending some real time with her husband, and when they finally arrived and settled into their new life in Oklahoma, their future again seemed filled with promise. But as they settled in, Arthur's behavior seemed even odder in some ways. All of those other personality quirks were still there, but he began taking very long walks by himself, sometimes spending hours outside alone. He also began opening up about the horrors that he said he witnessed in Vietnam, telling Linda about torture and murder that he had witnessed while over there, even violence inflicted on kids. It seemed like there was also a part of himself that enjoyed sharing these stories. Linda wasn't sure whether to believe them or not, though she didn't express any doubt to him. Arthur also started complaining that he didn't have any friends, that he could never please anybody. She tried to be as supportive as she could throughout all of this. Still, he never told Linda that he loved her, and she could never really feel it, or tell if he did. Some also more concerning characteristics began to emerge, like a possessiveness that she had never seen before. He would call Linda his woman and would get angry when other men on the base would so much as talk to her. He also seemed to grow meaner somehow, simultaneously distant and controlling. With all of these warning signs, Linda started to feel genuinely worried, and now she was isolated, living so far away from her own family. Along with these failures emerging in his personal life, Arthur was also not doing well at work with his duties on base at Fort Sill. He was a supply officer there, and he seemed to be doing the bare minimum at times, on the brink of insubordination at other times, and he was reprimanded often. He just developed this cloud of depression that seemed to hang around all aspects of his life. His already long walks alone became longer, and he would come home from work, eat dinner, and then wander alone by himself late into the night. When Linda asked him what he was doing out there, he would become evasive. When pushed, he would even say sometimes that he had blacked out, making Linda more alarmed than ever, wondering what he could possibly be doing out there. One night, he came back from a walk shaking and sobbing. Linda tried to calm him down to find out what was going wrong, and Arthur claimed that he'd had some flashbacks to Vietnam, to a kid that he'd killed who was working for the Viet Cong. His reaction seemed understandable if his story about Vietnam was true, the guilt and despair he seemed to be feeling. And again, Linda didn't know how to comfort him and wondered at what horrors he might have taken part in during the war. I will say we also do have reason to doubt Arthur's claims about Vietnam. Certainly there were atrocities committed during that war, but whether Arthur ever took part in them is questionable. I'll get into that more later on. Linda tried as best she could to be there for him and to give him the space he needed to open up, and it seemed like it kind of started to work. Arthur began admitting that he had started a few brush fires during his walks, though the way he phrased it always made it sound like some kind of accident. But Linda knew better and could see the strange fascination for starting fires in him. With Linda's encouragement, Arthur acknowledged that there was something wrong and went to see several Army psychiatrists. In their reports, they recognized that Arthur was mentally unwell. They warned Linda to keep him away from fire, even going so far as to tell her that Arthur was getting some kind of sexual satisfaction from it. Linda became increasingly scared that Arthur was going to hurt somebody. She even thought about committing him to a mental institution. Then came one of the most disturbing scenarios that Linda had witnessed to this point. She and Arthur had just gotten a new puppy, a very cute young dog they hoped would ease the tension in the household. But when the puppy nipped at Arthur, he reacted with a rage-fueled outburst. He grabbed the dog by the neck and threw it against the wall with all of his strength. The impact immediately snapped the dog's neck, killing it instantly. Almost immediately, that rage had passed, and Arthur was a different person again, breaking down and crying, insisting that it was an accident. Linda tried to comfort him, as she always did, but for the first time she really feared Arthur and didn't feel safe. It wasn't long after this that Arthur attempted suicide. Linda came home to find him on the floor and discovered that he'd swallowed a handful of pills. It was her call to police that saved his life. They told her that if she'd called only 15 minutes later, that Arthur would most likely be dead. Soon after this incident, things returned to an uneasy semblance of normal, and Arthur was honorably discharged from service. He and Linda moved back to Watertown, and they started to try to have a family. Linda was soon pregnant and more determined than ever to make the marriage work. That would all change with another act of violence that would confirm once and for all the warning that Arthur's first wife, Sarah, had given her. Despite what Linda was hoping, once they were back in their hometown, Arthur's behavior and mental state did not improve. He actually fell back into some of the behaviors he had had before the war, before he and Linda were married. Soon he was stealing, burglarizing local homes and businesses, and setting things on fire. All he wanted to do on his days off was go fishing, and he became withdrawn and resentful. The sweet and gentle person that she had fallen in love with was gone. Arthur began to say cruel and abusive things to her. criticizing her appearance, telling her that she was getting fat. Let me point out again that she was pregnant. Arthur began lying constantly and started drinking to excess, would crack open a beer as soon as he got home, and wouldn't stop until he went to bed. Finally, all of the tension that was building came to a head in a very violent way, another foreshadowing of the terrible violence that Arthur would inflict later in his life, sparked, like many other fights, by his insistence on controlling her, saying that she was spending too much time with her family and not enough time with him. The argument escalated verbally, but it was Arthur who turned to physical violence. Despite how much smaller she was than him, despite the fact that she was pregnant with their child, that she had always tried to love him and comfort him, Arthur attacked her. He didn't just slap her around. He beat her savagely, kicking and punching until she was on the ground and eventually blacked out completely. When she came to, she was alone in the house and still on the floor where he had left her. She crawled to her feet and looked at herself in the mirror, her face bloody and bruising, 2 black eyes and evidence of violence all over her. Arthur was nowhere to be found. Luckily, her family was in town now, and she called for their help. Soon, her family was there to take her to the hospital, though she was beaten so badly, punched and kicked in the stomach, that she ended up having a miscarriage. Linda's brother went after Arthur that very night. He found him and confronted him and ended up punching Arthur in the face, knocking him to the ground. Arthur didn't even defend himself. Whatever anger and rage that he had taken out of Linda, gone, or back deep under the surface. As days passed and Linda recovered in the hospital, whatever indecision or emotion that had kept her in a relationship with Arthur, despite all of the many warning signs, the difficulty and eventual abuse, that indecision had passed. She was certain now that she could never be with Arthur again, began to believe that having a miscarriage was for the best. Despite everything, the hell that he had put her through, she still felt compassion for Arthur. When he tried to call her days later, she took the call and told him that she didn't hate him, that she forgave him, but that she wanted a divorce. Arthur said no, that he would contest it, and started crying like a baby, like so many times in the past. This time, Linda couldn't stand to hear it, and hung up. Arthur then tried to kill himself again, slitting his wrists in the home that they had shared. It was Linda's father that found him, having gone to the house to get Linda's things so she could move out. He called an ambulance, and again, Arthur survived. When Linda was asked if she wanted to press charges, she declined. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks before she was well enough to be released. It seems that Linda was the one thing that had stopped Arthur from spiraling completely out of control. But once she was really gone, he lost it, going on some kind of petty crime spree, sticking up gas stations and burning down local businesses. He told people he just didn't care anymore. Ended up burning down a milk plant and barn. He was caught for this crime and was arrested. While in jail, they took him to a divorce court hearing. Linda was there too, though she refused to talk to Arthur or make any kind of statement at the time. Arthur did speak, saying that he wanted to make things right, that he wanted to stay with her. The judge offered to give them private time to talk things through, but it was no longer a question for Linda, and she refused. The guards had to physically drag Arthur away, and as they were pulling him from the courtroom, he told Linda that he loved her. It was the only time that he had ever said this to her, and the only time he ever would. Arthur was sentenced to 5 years in prison for this string of arsons and other crimes, time that he served at Attica Prison. Despite his dysfunction in the rest of society, Arthur turned out to be something of a model prisoner, polite and respectful to prison staff, and even friendly or funny at times. He was there during the infamous Attica prison riots, and though it's difficult to find any specifics, Arthur ended up helping one of the prison guards that day. This act was taken into consideration when he came up for parole. He was released back into society again after only 22 months. Arthur returned to Watertown soon afterward to begin again. Only a week after he was released, Arthur ran into a woman he'd gone to high school with named Penny Sherbino. Penny was a short woman with an easy laugh, and when she saw Arthur in the parking lot of a JCPenney, she noticed that he'd grown up into a good-looking man, barrel-chested and charming with a dimple in his chin. If you want to see a picture of him, you can go to our website at crimeandsacrifice.com, Shawcross episode part 2, and yeah, you make your own judgment. But that's what Penny thought. Arthur told her that he'd been away at Vietnam, that he'd seen combat, which made him sound a little dangerous, exciting. The two of them went out to dinner that very night. Penny wasn't really looking for a relationship, since she too was divorced and had 2 kids to look after alone. But Arthur was surprisingly persistent, and Penny was happy for the attention. Soon enough, they were dating regularly. When she found she was pregnant again, this time by Arthur, she was pleased at the concern he showed, his promise to stick by her side and to support her and her family. They moved in together to the Cloverdale Apartments, a blue-collar complex in the center of Watertown. At first, life seemed better, easier with him around. He definitely helped with expenses, but Penny also appreciated how well Arthur seemed to get on with her kids, playing with them and bringing them gifts. But there were some things about his habits and demeanor that surprised her. For one, he had seemed so gregarious and outgoing when they were dating. But now that they were living together, he was very quiet, sometimes spending an entire evening with little more than a few words shared between them. She was also put off by how much of a neat freak he was, how upset he would get if things were out of place or if he didn't have time to groom himself just right in the morning. She also noted a strange aversion to driving, that he would walk for miles on end to avoid getting behind the wheel of a car, and often would just take his bicycle. It was actually a woman's bike, ugly with a worn bucket in front. It seemed like an odd choice for a grown man that had seen combat in Vietnam. And as time went on, she noticed other odd behaviors. Would see him playing with other children in the yard of their apartment complex, especially young boys. He would roughhouse with them in a way that was unnerving to her, and she wasn't the only one that noticed. Somebody else reported a specific incident to police where Arthur was said to have grabbed one of the kids by the neck and that he began stuffing leaves down this boy's pants. Arthur's defense was that they were just playing, and somehow it all got blown out of proportion. No charges were filed against him. Over time, Penny noted that her 2-year-old also seemed to be distressed whenever she left Arthur alone with him. She began to wonder if there was something going on. Though it crossed her mind, she didn't entertain the idea seriously at the time. This was Arthur, the man that had stepped up, that she had gone to school with, that was interested in her, and that's all she would allow herself to see. There were other odd behaviors, too, that pointed to how out of place Arthur really was in society. There was an incident where he left a bouquet of flowers on a neighbor's doorstep with a note saying that they were for her funeral. The fact that he would sit in the living room for hours sometimes with a completely blank expression on his face, completely ignoring Penny and her kids. The fact that he would be out fishing all night, something that he seemed to genuinely love and take solace in, but he would come back sometimes in the morning without a single fish. Penny wondered if there could be something wrong with him, or if maybe he was having an affair. But she was able to rationalize some things and completely ignore others. And for the most part, besides these flashes of a disturbing inner life that was mostly hidden from her, Arthur was generally good to her, helping to prepare for the birth of their child. So when her parents began pressuring the two of them to get married before the baby was born, Penny gave in. Yes, she had her reservations, but she knew that no relationship or person was perfect, and thought this arrangement would be good enough. They prepared for a shotgun wedding within a few weeks and began planning a small ceremony in town. It's worth noting that Arthur had only been back to Watertown for a few months at this point after coming out of prison. In this time, he kind of cemented himself as an outcast and loner within his community. People would see him biking around town with his fishing rods sticking out of his bike, and most would stay clear of him. A lot of the kids near the Cloverdale apartments stayed away from him too. But there were other kids in town that didn't know Arthur. When he invited a couple of neighborhood boys out fishing one afternoon in the spring of 1972, they jumped at the chance. Their names were Pete and Jack Blake, and they were often seen running around and playing together in Watertown at the time. Jack was the older of the two, a quiet 10-year-old boy who was always looking out for his little brother, Pete. And on that first day going out with Arthur, they had a good time. But when Arthur asked the boys if they wanted to go out again, just days after the first time, Jack thought that they should get their mom's approval first. He had brought up the previous trip to her, and she had been upset about it. So, instead of disobeying her, Jack decided to bring Art back home to get the permission of his parents himself. Their mother, Mary, was a tough woman who had been through a lot in life. She was married to an alcoholic, absent husband named Pete and had to figure out how to take care of their kids without a great deal of help. They were poor, but the family looked out for each other. Although Jack didn't know it for most of his childhood, Mary's husband, Pete, was not his real father. He had been conceived at a time when both parents had strayed from the marriage. Mary was honest with him, and Pete was furious and heartbroken at first. He seemed committed to raising Jack like any of his other kids, but he did take out his frustrations and anxiety with drinking. He wasn't abusive with his family, but he was rarely sober, and the household was always struggling because of it. Jack didn't look or act like many of his half-siblings. He had blonde hair and freckles, and was quick to smile. The other kids were brown-haired, maybe more sullen and less prone to showing affection, though they all seemed to love Jack's influence on the family. And Pete, his younger brother, in particular, looked up to him. And it seems that Jack was growing up into a good person, thoughtful and respectful. In The Misbegotten Son, one of the primary sources for this episode, Jack Olson interviewed Mary about her son. She recounted a time that Jack saved Pete Jr. from drowning in Black River by putting himself in danger to jump in after his brother and drag him to safety. She also remembered other instances of Jack's selflessness. The time that he found $20 in a snowbank and insisted on spending most of the money on one of his friends. The only acts of disobedience that she could remember was when he would play hooky from school now and then. He was bright and full of love for the world, and especially for his family. Would hug his mom and tell her that he loved her every time he left the house. When he turned 10 years old, Mary felt that he was ready to know the truth about his father and told Jack that he wasn't Pete's son. He didn't react at all when she told him, though she could see that there was hurt. It was only a little while later that she saw him curled up with one of their cats, looking for some kind of comfort. And it wasn't long after this when Mary opened the door to her house and found that she was staring at some random 20-something-year-old man, asking to take her sons fishing. He was thin and wiry and wore glasses. Mary remembered her son telling her about this man, that he had already taken her boys out once without asking, and found something sinister or creepy about him, and she refused to let her sons go. Her husband Pete was home, and he refused as well. Arthur seemed polite enough about it, urging the boys to listen to their mother before shuffling away. Still, something about the whole exchange unnerved Mary. Although Mary didn't know it at the time, Jack and Pete went off again with Art later that week to go fishing. This time they didn't ask for permission. While they were out on the river, Art seemed to have no filter, telling them these horrific war stories and showing them pictures of naked women. Terrified, the boys ran off after that and didn't talk about it to their parents. It was just a few days after that when Mary noticed her son Jack hadn't come home yet as dusk fell, which she found odd. Jack didn't have a tendency to stay out late, and the family was playing bingo that night, something that he had always loved. His mother waited a couple of hours, but her panic began to grow, and by 9 p.m., Mary couldn't wait any longer. She went out looking for him in the neighborhood with a friend. They couldn't find him anywhere. When they returned home at 10 p.m. and Jack still wasn't there, Mary could sense that something must be wrong. At 10:30 p.m., Mary and her daughter went out again to alert and speak with neighbors, but still nobody had seen Jack. They called police soon afterward. As often happened at the time, they said they couldn't file a missing persons report until at least 24 hours had passed, though I think a lot of this has changed since then. But Watertown police did agree to send an officer to the scene, who came by the Blake household and asked some standard questions of Mary, asking where Jack might have been that day. Something about his line of questioning caused Mary to remember Art, his strange fascination with her boys, and the unsettling conversation at her doorstep. She brought up Art's name that very night, saying the only information that she really knew about him was that he lived in the Cloverdale apartments. The officer agreed to go and speak with Art, but told Mary that she would have to stay home. But Mary, being kind of a firecracker of a woman, even fiercer when it came to protecting her kids, wouldn't listen, and proceeded to drive behind the officer's patrol car to the Cloverdale apartments. She followed the officer upstairs and stood behind him in the hallway while he pounded on Arthur's door. To Mary's surprise, Arthur answered and seemed completely calm as he explained that he hadn't seen Jack since the day prior. With nothing more to go on than Mary's panicked suspicions, the officer tried to leave, but Mary demanded that Arthur tell her where her son was. Arthur only shrugged. Penny Sherbino was shocked to find police at her door, but Arthur reassured her that nothing was wrong. The police were just asking some questions about a local boy he'd seen, but that he knew nothing about it. He wouldn't talk about it further, and just several days later, the two of them went ahead with their wedding ceremony as planned, surrounded by only a few family members. As for Mary Blake, police tried to reassure her and kept hinting that maybe Jack had gotten lost or run away, that he would likely turn up. But as the days passed without any sign of him, it became clear to Mary that something had happened. What made it even worse was that it felt to her like police weren't doing anything. And so Mary began focusing all of herself into drawing attention to her son's disappearance and her disappointment in police. She called up every news outlet in town and was able to get the case featured in newspapers and TV broadcasts. Her son's description printed on the front page of the local paper. Her persistence caused the community to rally around her and to organize searches through nearby woods. Mary even began calling local and state politicians to beg for more to be done to help find her boy. Police told her that they'd hit a roadblock, with no leads and nothing to go on. But police hadn't even assigned a single investigator to Jack's case until Mary called up Mayor Ted Rand, who convinced Sheriff Irving Angel to finally assign an officer. After several days of searching with no success, Mary was reminded of Art as she was speaking with some local kids that swore that Arthur had asked Jack to go fishing on the day that he disappeared. Mary immediately called police and demanded that they have Art arrested. But police couldn't arrest him just on the shaky testimony of some local kids and urged patience, which of course sounded to Mary like they were still dragging their feet. With Mary's persistence, newspapers continued to feature updates about Jack's disappearance prominently, and police kept the case on the top of their list. Through their own investigation, they did uncover several credible witnesses who saw Shawcross leading Jack into the woods on the day that he disappeared. When they looked into Arthur, they saw a mountain of previous crimes that he had been convicted of. And the convictions for burglary and arson didn't look great, but it wasn't completely damning from the perspective of police either, since he didn't seem to have any official record of harming kids. To them, it seemed like two very different kinds of crime. Yes, they'd had a complaint about roughhousing with some local boy, but it still seemed like a stretch. Despite this, they questioned Arthur several times, and he was definitely on police radar. But in the end, there was nothing solid for them to go on to arrest him. Days turned into weeks. And despite Mary's desperate and relentless campaign, public interest eventually waned, as media coverage and organized searches became fewer and further between. Like a lot of highly publicized cases, there were many false leads that followed, things that tortured the family and resulted in many sleepless nights for Mary. She wondered at the cruelty of people when she received hoax prank calls, began going down a rabbit hole of wondering if maybe Jack had been kidnapped, if maybe he was alive out there. Soon people reported that she was shambling around town like a ghost. And Arthur continued on with his life much as he had been throughout the summer of 1972, working during the day and spending much of his free time alone. And Penny believed her now husband, but was upset because he seemed more moody than ever, refusing at first to talk about the case, and then refusing to talk to her about anything at all. They started eating dinner in silence, which Penny attributed to the pressure from police and blamed them for the growing distance between her and Arthur. And as the end of summer approached, many visitors came to Watertown to celebrate the long Labor Day weekend. Helen Hill was among them and came with her kids to visit the family of her boyfriend, Stan Fisher, who was a Watertown native. Helen was a small woman, sharp with a great sense of humor. Even into adulthood, she remained very close to her 8 brothers and sisters and was known as the clown of the family, always making her friends and family laugh. Helen had grown up in Rochester, New York, and lived there still. She had eventually married a man who worked at Kodak and had 4 kids with him. But Helen's husband, too, was a drinker, and their marriage eventually fell apart, and Helen was left to raise their kids alone. After a series of additional hardships for the family, including a fire in their home and financial troubles, Helen was living with her mom and working to get back on her feet when she met Stan, another Rochester resident with a great sense of humor and a kind demeanor, and the two soon began dating. Things were going well when he invited Helen to come to meet his extended family in Watertown, and she was excited to do so. At first, she was only going to bring one of her daughters with her, Chrissy, but her 8-year-old daughter Karen Ann begged to be able to come along, and eventually her mother relented. Karen was a rambunctious girl, brown-eyed and with blonde hair, tall and lanky for her age. She had inherited a large portion of her personality from her mom, and she was not shy about being in the limelight, loved to sing in front of family and friends, and told people she was going to be a movie star when she grew up. And so, Helen, Stan, Karen, and Chrissy all bundled into the car to make the 2.5-hour journey to Watertown that Labor Day weekend. When they arrived, they parked and said hello to Stan's family at a house that was just around the corner from Mary Blake's. Helen and her girls hit it off with Stan's family, and Helen was soon able to take Karen around town to walk with her on its wide, tree-lined streets to the center of town so Karen could toss coins in the town's fountain. Helen bought Karen Ann an ice cream cone at a nearby shop. It was a great day. The following day, Saturday, Helen dressed Karen in a red, white, and blue top and tried to get herself ready for even more festivities. Around midday, Karen wanted to play outside, but Helen was still getting ready. She gave her daughter permission to go outside alone, but only if she stayed in the yard. Helen had already walked around the neighborhood and felt pretty secure there. She thought nothing of it when she checked in on Karen a little while later and saw her playing with the neighbors and their pet rabbit. A little while later, when Helen was finished getting ready, she went out to get Karen, but she didn't see her in the yard anymore. Her first instinct wasn't to panic. It was a beautiful day in Watertown, and there were people and kids everywhere. Helen figured her daughter had probably just run off with some other kids and would be back home soon. But after a couple of hours passed, Helen's level of concern grew. She walked with Stan's half-sister Linda to the town square and back again to look for her, where they had gone the day before, stopping into the ice cream parlor to see if any of the employees had seen her that day. They hadn't. Helen was starting to feel real panic, but Stan's family tried to reassure her that maybe she had just lost track of time. But by 6 p.m., Helen couldn't wait any longer, and she called police. At this point, her biggest fear was that Karen really had gotten lost. But when police arrived, They didn't hesitate and started to search for Karen immediately, the memory of Jack's disappearance and Mary Blake's accusations still very fresh. It wasn't long before word spread throughout Watertown that a girl was missing, and many banded together to try to search for her. A local radio station broadcast the girl's description, and tips started coming in from everywhere. Piecing together witness testimony from around town, police would later find that several people had spotted Karen that afternoon. A man had seen her walking toward the Black River and had thought she seemed a little bit young to be off alone. A college student also called in to report that he'd seen a girl matching Karen's description climbing up Pearl Street Bridge. Police also questioned a group of teenagers that had noticed something down by the river later that day. Not Karen, but a man with a bicycle and fishing gear near the same bridge. He smiled at them as they passed. When Mary Blake heard of the disappearance, her heart started aching for another mother going through the terror that she knew so well. She and her son Pete helped in the search that night. Mary felt like police needed to question Arthur Shawcross with this new disappearance, but she kept her suspicions to herself, believing from past experience that police wouldn't listen to her. Through all of the tips coming in, police began focusing their search on Pearl Street Bridge in the Black River. This is where they focused their efforts as night fell. And then their search was over. They had found Karen Ann, and she was dead. Worse, she had been murdered. A warning that the next minute is extremely difficult and involves violence against a child, so feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to hear the details. Karen's body was found under the bridge and next to a sewage pipe, slabs of concrete hastily placed over her body to conceal her. She had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and beaten, with dirt, leaves, and other debris shoved down her throat. An impossible scene, so horrific and inhuman, such a careless disregard for a beautiful human life. Many of the officers on scene couldn't take it, though police tried to take comfort in the fact that there was a good chance that she had been murdered before she was viciously beaten and repeatedly assaulted. Police detectives clung on to this hope, bitter and uncertain as it was. Police called Helen and told her to come to the station. They wouldn't give her any information over the phone, which terrified her. But again, her biggest fear at the time was that Karen had been injured in some kind of accident. When she arrived at the station, police asked her to sit down. She refused. When they told her that Karen was dead, Helen would not believe it at first, asked to see her girl's body, then insisted to know what had happened. They told her that Karen had been murdered. Police were quick to focus on Arthur Shawcross this time around because of his connections to the still missing Jack Blake, but also because of witness testimony and the several groups of people that seemed to recall Arthur in the vicinity of the bridge around the time that Karen was spotted, riding alone on his bike with his fishing gear. Police picked Arthur up at home that very night, and he went with them willingly down to the station, as cooperative and calm as always. It was Detective Charles Kubinski who was tasked with questioning Arthur in this case, an old-school cop who saw through Arthur's demeanor and wondered if they might have a psychopath on their hands, somebody lacking any emotion or empathy. If Arthur truly was their man, Kubinski was intent on getting a full confession, not only for Karen Ann's murder, but for what he suspected was Jack Blake's too. Maybe they could finally get his family some closure. Kubinski questioned Arthur for hours that first night, though he was careful to do everything by the book, to read Arthur his Miranda rights and to let him know he didn't have to talk to police. Arthur had been very accommodating so far. Kubinski could only hope that Arthur would keep talking before lawyering up. Hours passed with Arthur telling them the story of where he'd been that day several times. Arthur talked about fishing alone and said that he had never seen Karen Ann. But Kubinski noted that Arthur's story seemed to shift with each retelling, several holes and inconsistencies developing, the timeline never quite consistent. Kubinski also noted that when more difficult questions arose, Arthur would have this blank look, would stop talking and just stare off into space. But when morning rolled around without a confession, police had no choice but to release Arthur Shawcross back to the community. Still, Kubinski didn't give up, pulling Arthur back in for questioning several times over the next couple of days. Sometimes he felt so close, with Arthur alluding to guilt without coming out and saying it, asking things like what would happen if he were to confess. Kubinski tried to answer these questions like he would to a friend, tried all he could to keep Arthur talking. But it was a very delicate dance, and one that he knew couldn't be rushed. He needed to make Arthur feel like he was on his side, as disgusting as that was for Kubinski at the time. And finally, several days after Karen Ann was killed, Kubinski's work and persistence paid off. Arthur confessed to her killing. The department was thrilled at this development, and yet Kubinski himself was not yet satisfied. First of all, Arthur's confession was far from the kind of solid one that you would want to really hold up in court. Instead of providing details and motive, Arthur had eventually just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said that he must have done it, but that he couldn't remember the details. While this was enough to keep him in custody, Kubinski knew that they needed more. He was slightly relieved when a group of girls picked Arthur out of a lineup as a man that they had seen with a bike and fishing gear near the bridge where Karen Ann's body was found. But still, there were a lot of people out that day. It still didn't seem like it was enough. Kubinski was also not happy with just a confession for Karen Ann. He was certain that Arthur was also responsible for Jack's disappearance, and he would not allow himself to rest until he got that information out of Arthur too. Looking back through the files for Jack's case, Kubinski noted that some witness testimony seemed promising, that a gas station worker had seen Arthur walking out of the woods on the day that Jack Blake disappeared. Kubinski was sure that he could get another confession out of Arthur, wanted to finally solve that case and find Jack's body. He also knew that, now that Arthur had confessed to Karen's killing, it was only a matter of time before he was assigned a lawyer. He needed to act quickly if he was ever going to get this information out of Arthur. As difficult as it was, he found that pretending to be friendly with Arthur was the most effective way of gaining his trust. Eventually, Art agreed to help, began alluding to a previously unsearched area of the woods where police might find Jack's remains, but said that he needed to sleep on it before confessing fully. When Kubinski shared these developments with his superior officers, he was dismayed that they wanted to start searching that area of the woods right away. They didn't have a confession yet, or even a specific area to search for the body, and if police found Jack without Arthur specifically directing them to his body, there would be no direct evidence linking Arthur to the crime. But Kubinski's supervisors didn't agree, saying that it had been long enough for Jack Blake's family to wait, and they immediately started gathering search parties. Arthur was even less cooperative when he woke the next morning, and he was finally out of time. It was later that day that police teams finally found what they were looking for, the body of a child that was little more than a skeleton at the time. Mary confirmed that the clothes found on scene matched those of her son. And while some in the department were celebrating and popping champagne, Kubinski was furious, knowing that their chances of definitively pinning the case on Arthur were deteriorating with every clumsy victory. Jack's body was examined, but with so many months in the wilderness, exposed to the elements, it was difficult to determine what had happened to him. The medical examiner guessed that it was a violent end, but couldn't say how and couldn't say for sure. One awful thing that was clear was that Jack had been stripped prior to death, his clothes found bundled nearby. With these revelations, but without proof, another blow came for police as Arthur's court-appointed lawyer stepped in and prevented any further interviews. The defense counsel assigned to Arthur was a man named Paul Deerdorf. He began filing motion after motion, claiming that Arthur had below-average intelligence, that the confession for Karen Ann's murder had been coerced, just as Kubinski feared. Police were desperate for any concrete evidence linking Arthur to her death at a time before DNA could link him to the body. But there was no other physical evidence found on Karen or Jack. and the case was looking more and more uncertain as time passed, despite the calls in the community for Arthur to hang. Penny came to visit him while he was in jail, and police tried to get her to help, asked her to wear a wire and get a confession from him, one that was more likely to stand up in court. But Penny refused. She genuinely believed Art was innocent, believed that police were lying to her about Arthur's criminal history, and Art had told her that he was being framed. She believed him. Around the same time, Art sent a mutual friend to his former wife, Linda, maybe the one woman he had really loved, and explained to her that he hadn't meant to kill these kids, that he'd had flashbacks to his time in Vietnam. Linda wondered if he might have killed before, remembering Arthur's long walks alone in Oklahoma. When finally faced with the impending trial, Jefferson County District Attorney William McCluskey, looking at all the evidence in both cases, believed that it was all incredibly weak, particularly when it came to Jack's death. Arthur hadn't led them to Jack's body, had just mentioned a broad section of woods to search, and the medical examiner couldn't even say officially how the boy had died. There was no way to know for sure what happened, certainly no way to prove it in court, and McCluskey knew that it would be an uphill battle, maybe an impossible one. And now Arthur's defense counsel, Deerdorf, would not let up, was claiming that proper protocol had not been followed for Karen Ann's case, showing that fingerprints weren't taken on the scene, that they didn't compare Arthur's blood type to the semen found, that they didn't test Karen's body for a more accurate time of death, already sowing seeds for reasonable doubt in her case too, despite the confession. Deerdorf was even trying to have the case dismissed. The judge ultimately decided to move forward, but he acknowledged in court that the case against Arthur was circumstantial at best. He was indicted on 2 counts: intending to commit murder and causing a child's death while engaging in an act of rape. It all involved Karen's death. There was nothing about Jack in the indictment at all, despite how difficult it was for anybody involved to swallow. Arthur had basically confessed to murdering Jack to Kubinski, and yet there was nothing solid, and now they had Deerdorf to get through. And of course the public was outraged at the charges, that they didn't include Jack. Mary Blake told reporters that she wasn't surprised, given that she was already so suspicious and skeptical of police. And Kubinski went to the DA for some kind of justice, for Jack's death too. To his disgust, McCluskey told him that they intended to offer Shawcross a deal. Kubinski got it on some level. He knew how the courts worked. But it was a very bitter thing to accept. And that is what District Attorney William J. McCluskey did, as he interviewed Arthur Shawcross to form the basis of a plea deal on October 16, 1972. He still intended to put Shawcross in prison for a substantial amount of time, and wanted Arthur to confess to at least have some responsibility for the death of Jack Blake, viewed this plea bargain as a considerable upgrade from the near impossible trial ahead of him. During this interview, Arthur not only confessed to the murder of Karen Ann, but also admitted to killing Jack, though the story he told is almost certainly not what actually happened. According to Arthur, Jack began following him as he went off to go fishing. Arthur tried to get the boy to run off and to leave him alone, but Jack kept following him, and he got angry. Arthur claims that he pushed Jack to get away from him. Jack fell, hit his head, and no longer moved. That was the story he told. Arthur claimed to then have panicked, covering the boy's body with some tree bark before running off. Given Arthur's background, his fascination with children, and his previous history with Jack, plus what police know happened to Karen Ann, I think we can say with certainty that the story he told was not the truth. Obviously an attempt to minimize his guilt, to call it an accident. But McCluskey didn't push him on this at all, didn't ask him to explain why Jack was found naked, why they were so far away from the rest of town and Jack's home. Maybe he felt that to do so would compromise the plea deal, and the case already felt so shaky to him. Or maybe he was happy to get any kind of admission of guilt about Jack at all. However, this decision would haunt many people, including Kubinski, who had been so close to getting a true admission of guilt from Arthur. In the end, the plea deal went through. Arthur was convicted of first-degree manslaughter for Karen Hill, despite the fact that it was clearly murder, the most horrific kind. And despite the community's outrage, DA Will McCluskey was somewhat satisfied with the outcome, viewed it as a victory in a difficult situation. He had also been able to secure a 25-year sentence for Arthur. Given that McCluskey thought that kids were in immediate danger with Arthur on the street, he figured at least this would keep him locked up for some time, would protect the public in the immediate term. It is important to note that this sentence was labeled as indeterminate, which meant that technically Arthur could be released in as little as 10 months. But given the nature of his crime, every person involved in putting him away thought that at least he would serve that full 25 years, and it felt like some kind of protection. But the public did not agree with this turn of events, and many citizens were shocked that such a deal had been struck, that there would be no formal justice for Jack Blake. Some members of the community started marching in the streets, wanting to storm the jail and publicly execute Arthur, and other inmates in jail despised him, one trustee attacking him in the jail's kitchen. This resulted in Arthur being locked in his own cell for his protection. The night after the deal was struck, Arthur was allowed to meet briefly with Penny and his parents before he was quickly and quietly shipped off to state prison at Attica, an attempt to prevent vigilantes from doing something to him. It had been almost exactly a year to the day since Arthur had first left Attica. The ripples of Arthur's actions during this time are hard to comprehend. For the Watertown community, they had a long way to go to heal after this, and it was a long and difficult road. It's arguable that Mary and her family never really did, and she held nothing back in her scathing criticism of the Watertown Police Department for years to come. Helen Hill seemed more understanding, thankful to everybody for their help, speaking publicly that she wanted the friendship and understanding of others most of all during that difficult time. But she would never be the same. She ended up moving to Watertown after this incident, just wanting to be close to the place where Karen had died. The guilt nearly destroyed her. She simply could not forgive herself for getting ready that day, suffering the agony of so many what-ifs. She was only 35 years old at the time, but a permanent shock of white hair appeared from the stress. Helen was also already very thin, but lost a tremendous amount of weight after that, falling from 115 to 89 pounds. And yet she was so bloated that she looked pregnant. She had trouble sleeping and was ridden with guilt for her other children too, that she couldn't be the same kind of mom for them. She couldn't laugh as easily, could not continue as the family's comic relief. She just didn't feel that brightness anymore, with her frequent nightmares and panic attacks. She even thought about suicide. But luckily she had a large, loving family that was there for her and helped her to recover in time and continue living. And everybody involved in putting him away believed that Arthur would serve all of those 25 years, couldn't imagine him being released beforehand. Arthur would be back on the street in less than 15. And that is where we'll leave it for this week. Join us for the conclusion of the Arthur Shawcross series next time. Before I go, I would like to mention, again, one important source that I used in this series. A book called The Misbegotten Son, A Serial Killer and His Victims, The True Story of Arthur J. Shawcross by Jack Olson. It's a very well-researched piece of journalism that provides first-person interviews with victims, investigators, and even peripherally with Shawcross himself that I found to be especially insightful in telling this story. We'll have a link in the episode show notes, along with all of the sources used, some photos, and a transcript at crimeandsacrifice.com. So yeah, if you have any thoughts or you want to share anything or reasons that you liked this episode or hated it or whatever, yeah, you can reach me there. We've got our email address, social media, all that. Also, I know you hear this on podcasts a lot, and I know it's kind of annoying, but if there is any way you can rate and review the show, if you haven't already, we really do appreciate it. It It helps us rank higher in podcast apps like Apple and could help other people find the show. Thank you for listening. What kind of person will you choose to be?